The other organ in the central nervous system is the spinal cord. Nerves that connect to it are called spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs. They're in between every two vertebrae, and that includes the separate vertebrae that become the sacrum, and there's one between the sacrum and coccyx, and one between the atlas and occipital bone. The cervical and lumbar regions of the spinal cord are thicker because that's where nerves for the arms and legs connect, so there's more processing going on in that area. After the lumbar enlargement, the spinal cord itself tapers off as separate nerves branch off it. These are called the cauda equina. Anyone know what a cauda is? One of the alternative terms for inferior or posterior for things on four legs was caudal, which means towards the tail. Okay? What's an equine? Horse. So your spinal cord has a ponytail at the end. The reason that happens, these are lumbar vertebrae here. The spinal cord actually stops fairly high up in the lumbar region, and that's because it doesn't grow as fast as your spine does, but the nerves can grow. So the nerves end up going into the spinal column, with the spinal cord being shorter. It's useful clinically because where the cauda equina is, you can more safely stick a needle in and not have to worry about hitting the spinal cord. In fact, the needle pushing through the meninges creates a current, and the nerves just flow out of the way. So it's a much safer place to inject an anesthetic if you needed to go actually into the spinal cord with it, or to take a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. So that's why I say lumbar puncture down in the lumbar region.
Is that kind of where they put an epidural for when you have a baby?
It's in that area, although epidural means that it's in the epidural space.
Okay.
So it primarily affects the nerves that are coming in, though some of it diffuses into the spinal column. In cross-section, right in the middle is a little hole, that's the central canal. So it runs the full length of the spinal cord and has cerebrospinal fluid in it. So it's there in the center in addition to the subarachnoid space. There are deep grooves in the front and back called anterior and posterior median fissures. The gray matter is inner, and it forms kind of a butterfly shape. In this view, the way you can tell anterior and posterior, most of the time they put posterior at the top, but if they didn't, the gray matter goes right to the edge on the posterior side, but it stops on the anterior side, and there's white matter between the gray and the surface. You'll also be able to tell the difference from the shape of the nerves coming in. They're not really shown that well here. We can see that this bulge continues back to this side. The bulge is always going to be on the posterior nerve. The portions of gray matter are referred to as horns. We're not going to worry about those, but you'll run across it in the lab book and the textbook. The white matter is organized into columns. So there's this posterior column here, and then I'm not sure exactly where they divide it, but columns around the front and side as well. So the spinal cord has two major functions, one handled by the gray matter and one by the white matter. The gray matter processes reflexes. These are responses that are simple, so you don't need anything as complex as the brain to make a decision, and need to be made quickly. Usually the result of a reflex is contracting a skeletal muscle, like in the song, touch the hot pan or the hot stove and had to pull his hand away. You do that without even noticing that you're about to do it because the spinal cord sends the message right out to the muscle. Then the white matter transmits information to and from the brain. The pathway of information for spinal reflex is called a reflex arc because it comes in, curves around, and then goes back out the same side. If we take half a spinal cord, start with sensory neuron. That takes the information into the spinal cord where it's processed. The processing in most reflexes includes a second neuron, which is an interneuron. The interneuron does two things. It sends the information up to the brain, and it contacts the third messenger, the motor neuron. I'm going to make that a little shorter. The motor neuron will stimulate the muscle that needs to contract. We can look at a reflex the same way as a homeostatic mechanism, where you've got the stimulus. The receptor would be a pain receptor in your skin in this case. The sensory neuron carries it. The control center is the gray matter of the spinal cord. The motor neuron takes the message out to the effector, which is the muscle. So that's your basic reflex arc. Three messengers in it: sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. The interneuron is part of the control center. There are a couple of different types of reflex. The two major ones are postural and withdrawal reflexes. A postural reflex is an automatic way of maintaining posture. So simple enough that the cerebellum doesn't even need to get involved. What a postural reflex comes down to is a muscle is stretched, so it contracts to counteract the stretch. The patellar reflex, where you hit your knee and it kicks, what's going on there is you are hitting the quadriceps tendon or the patellar ligament, and that stretches the quadriceps. The signal goes up to the spinal cord, and your body reacts as if your knee were buckling, so you need to contract your quads, straighten your knee to stay upright. Now, in postural reflexes, there's not actually an interneuron. The sensory neuron just talks directly to the motor neuron, and the decision making is just a matter of, is this stretch strong enough to cause an action potential in the motor neuron and tell the muscle to contract. Withdrawal reflexes do follow this pathway. This is where the stimulus is some kind of pain. The muscle contraction is to move your body part away from it. So touch the hot stove, step on a tack and pick up your foot. Sometimes the response is a little more complicated. For example, with picking up your foot, if you have just taken your weight off the other foot, you need to straighten the other leg to make sure you don't fall over as you're picking up the foot that stepped on something. So a more complex message goes out. Questions on reflex types? And we're going to get to do reflexes in lab today. It's all postural reflexes, but you get to hit each other's tendons with those little triangular hammers. For transmitting information, this is done by collections of axons called tracts. We mentioned tracts before. These are found in the white matter, groups of axons running together, where a particular area like this would be a column. A tract is a smaller portion that's going from the same place to the same place and just has multiple neurons, so there's plenty of strength to carry the message. They're shown here in the pink and brown. The two types of tracts are named for which way they're going. An ascending tract is going up or towards the brain, so it's for sensory information. Those are the ones shown in pink. A descending tract is going down, so from the brain, so those are transmitting the motor information. There are names for the tracts that are all based on where the two ends are. If it has spino first, it means it's going from the spinal cord to somewhere in the brain, so it's ascending. If it's something spinal, then it's going from the brain to the spinal cord and it's descending. I'm not going to ask you to know any of the names for them, but there is a matching exercise for them in the lab. Questions on tracts? Okay. That takes us to the peripheral nervous system. There are spinal nerves and cranial nerves. Spinal nerves connect to the spinal cord. How many pairs did we say? 31. Cranial nerves connect directly to the brain, so they go into the cranium. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And you've seen these names because they were in the lab we did last week. Your basic nerve structure is similar to muscle structure, where you've got the whole thing, fascicles, and fibers. Here the fibers are axons rather than whole cells, but they're still bundled together in fascicles, so each of these would be a fascicle. And there are the same 3 layers of connective tissue. Here instead of mycium, it's neurium. Endoneurium is around each axon, perineurium is around the fascicle, epineurium is around the whole nerve. And these little red and blue dots are small blood vessels to make sure the axons are nourished and have plenty of oxygen, have their wastes taken away. Cranial nerves are also paired. They get names and Roman numerals, and the numbers start in front, go back and then down, and then number 12 is kind of the odd one out. Cranial nerves can be sensory, where they're just carrying information into the brain. They can be motor, where they're just going to control muscles or other organs, because this includes autonomic, or both, in which case they're called mixed nerves. They have sensory and motor messages, so they're two-way streets. But for tricks to remember them, mixed starts with M, same as motor, so saying both would work better for that. So starting from number 1, working our way out and back. The first 3 all start with O. Olfactory. Anyone know what olfaction is? That's your sense of smell. So the olfactory nerve is for smell. So it's a pure sensory. And it's way in the front, just above your nose. The olfactory bulbs on the brain are where they connect. Next is the optic nerves for vision, so another one that's purely sensory. They go from your eyes back to the optic chiasma in the diencephalon. So, because they connect to the brain further back, they're considered the second nerve, even though your eyes are just as far out as your nose. Oculomotor. Motor, oculo is eyes, so this one is for eye movements. It also controls the eyelids and dilation of the pupil. So it is all motor. The trochlear nerve is also for eye movements, and there's one more that is on the next slide. Basically, there are 6 muscles that control your eyes. The oculomotor nerve controls 4 of them, along with the pupils and eyelids. The trochlear nerve controls 1 more. Number 6, the abducens nerve, controls the 6th muscle. Before you get to that, number 5 is the trigeminal nerve. That means triplets.